Rental Housing in the Urban Landscape by Jennifer Sweet. I have a keen interest in real estate, and I'm particularly interested in something I've been observing since we've been living outside a metro area. Historically, in small towns, individuals may choose to rent because they can't afford to buy. But in the metro setting, that's not the case at all. Individuals from all economic levels participate in the rental landscape, which caused me to ask this question. I wonder if there's a relationship between rent and income in metro areas. And I hypothesize that there is a relationship between rent and income, and that higher income households face less cost burden in urban rental housing, regardless of changes in employment. Conversely, lower income households will face a higher cost burden in urban rental housing and will be affected by changes in employment. Cost burdens are defined as housing costs of more than 30% of household income. My data set comes from the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University, from a report entitled America's Rental Housing: Evolving Markets and Needs. I'll be looking specifically at severely cost burdened, and those are households where 50% or more of the monthly income is spent on housing. As we can see from the map, large shares of renters across the country are housing cost burdened. And I'll be focusing on those 50% and up, which are primarily indicated by the dark orange states. From the report, by income, the largest increase in renters, 4 million, was among households earning less than $25,000 annually, both because low-income households are much more likely to rent, and because their numbers had swelled following the recession. The growth in the number of renters earning $50,000 or more was nearly as large, at 3.3 million, including an increase of 1.6 million earning $100,000 or more. While such high-income households still represent a relatively small share of renters, the rate of growth of this segment has far outpaced that of other income groups and testifies to the growing appeal of renting among households with substantial financial means. As we can see by this bar graph, low-income renters with severe cost burdens have much less to spend on critical necessities, including food. Now let's look at the variables. My Y variable, my dependent variable, will be median renter monthly housing cost. For ease of language, I'll commonly refer to this as rent. My independent variables, my X variables, will be median renter household income, to which I will just refer to this as income, and renters with income over $75,000 who are severely cost burdened, renters with income between $45,000 to $74,999, $30,000 to $44,999, $15,000 to $29,999, and renters with income under $15,000. And all of these are those who are severely cost burdened, spending 50% or more of their income on rent. I'll also be using an independent X variable of average annual change in employment. This variable will be the dummy variable. The highest unit of change in employment was 5.1, so I divided that in half, and the resulting answer 2.5 became my division line. So a change in employment equal to or greater than 2.5, I assigned a value of 1. A change in employment less than 2.5, I've assigned a value of 0. For ease of calculation, I thought this made a suitable dummy variable. This is a line graph that shows rent as explained by income. As we see income increasing over the long term, rent also increases, although it has many peaks and valleys, which tells us perhaps we should look at some other variables to explain this relationship. This is a brief sample of the data set. As you can see, we have our metropolitan areas, and then we have all of our X variables and our Y variable over to the right. Our Y variable being rent, X variables being that change in employment, our dummy variable, income, and then our severely cost burdened in our different income brackets. There are 2 points I want to show you here, one being severely burdened, $75,000 and up. As we can see by looking at the data, we can tell that it's very, very low. In fact, the highest amount is 1.0 in Bridgeport, Stamford, Norwalk, Connecticut. From that, we can tell that possibly few people are severely cost burdened in this income bracket of $75,000 and up. But conversely, if we look at those severely burdened under $15,000, we see that everyone is above 50% in every statistical area. in fact, the highest being 87% in Austin Round Rock, Texas. So from that, we can infer that there will be many people under $15,000 who are severely cost burdened. This is a link to the data source, which includes all of the 100 samples and the compiled report. Is there a statistically significant relationship between median monthly housing costs and income? The no would be the slope is equal to 0. There's no relationship between median monthly housing costs and income. The alternative would be a slope not equal to 0, that there is a relationship between median monthly housing costs and income. In this case, I hope to reject the null and accept the alternative. Estimated coefficient signs. Initially, I felt that we would have all positive coefficient signs because I felt there were positive relationships with all of these. As I looked at some of the data, I see that the severely burdened under $15,000 and the severely burdened $75,000 and up had some anomalies to them, and I felt that perhaps we will see some negative coefficient signs. This is a chart graph for the dummy variable. The sampling was of 100 items, and of that we saw that 64 had a change in employment less than 2.5. So I had to assign the value of 0. The others were 2.5 or greater, and that's indicated in the red to the right. Now let's look at some scatter plots. Our first one is rent as explained by income. And as you can see, it has a high R-squared telling us that 83% of the variation in rent is explained by income. And as you can see, many of the lines are located close to that line of best fit. Next, we have rent as explained by severely cost burdened with income of $75,000 and up. This scatter plot has a relatively low R-squared compared to our other models. The higher income sampling only explains 36% of the variation in rent. But as you can see, we do have one plot off to the right where we have a high percentage of cost burdened also in a high rent area. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. Our next slide is rent as explained by severely burdened $45,000 through $74,999. This has a high R-squared of 72%. It also has that same plot that's off to the right, a high amount of cost burden and a relatively high rent. And we find that that specific plot represents urban Honolulu, Hawaii. So we ask ourselves, why might that be the case? Well, as economists, we live in a world of scarcity, so I would conclude that the reason this is here is because in a high income bracket specifically, is that on an island there's a finite amount of rental opportunities, and in addition, Hawaii is a tropical climate, which may drive desirability and demand, as opposed to maybe an Arctic island, which may not create that same outlier. Rent is explained by severely burdened $30,000 through $44,999. This has our highest R-squared of 90%. 90% of the variation in rent is explained by the severely burdened renters with an income of $30,000 through $44,999. Now we're looking at rent as explained by those severely cost burdened in the $15,000 through $29,999. That is our second highest R-squared of 85%. And finally, we're looking at rent as explained by those under $15,000 who are severely cost burdened. And as you can see, this has an extremely low R-squared. Only 7% of the variation in rent is explained by the severely cost burdened, under $15,000. And as you can tell just by looking at the plots, they're all over, and it's very difficult to make a line of best fit. Now let's look at a simple linear regression in which y equals rent and x equals income. We do have a relatively high R-squared of 83%, so 83% of the variation in rent is explained by the variation in income. But when we look at our p-values, we see that 7.5 is much higher than the 0.05 we were looking for. So we have to say it is not statistically significant. Let's look at our multilinear regression. As we can see, the R squared is 98%, which is high, so that's very good. We see that 98% of that variation in rent is explained by our multiple independent variables. However, not all the independent variables are statistically significant. So to be statistically significant, we want the individual p-values to be less than 0.05. 4 independent variables are not in that range, and therefore we must accept the null that there's no relationship between those severely burdened $45,000 through $74,999 and severely burdened $75,000 and up. Those are our two highest brackets. And we also must conclude that there's no relationship between severely burdened under $15,000, our lowest bracket. And also, our average annual change of employment was not statistically significant either. So for every 1 unit increase, every 1 unit percentage change in severely burdened from 15,000 through 29,999, we see a 6.4 unit increase in the median renter monthly housing cost. For every 1 unit increase or percentage change in those severely burdened 30,000 through 44,999, we'll see a 7.98 dollar increase in median renter housing cost. And then lastly, for every 1 unit increase in renter household income, we see a 0.01 unit increase in median renter monthly housing cost. Estimation. They're not statistically significant. This is an example of how we could use this for estimation. Implications. So I've rejected the null and proved the alternative hypothesis. My findings support that original research report. There is a relationship between rent and income in metro areas, and higher income households face less cost burden in urban rental housing, regardless of changes in employment. Lower income households face a higher cost burden in urban rental housing, but surprisingly, they're not affected by changes in employment. So we have excluded the most affluent and the lowest income brackets because they have weak ties to the median renter housing cost. So right in the middle is where we have the strongest relationship to the median renter housing costs, and that gave us the best example of a relationship. Lowest income was too dependent, the highest brackets were not dependent at all or too little dependent. And from an economist standpoint, their cost burden does not have a relationship with median renter housing costs. Change in employment was not statistically significant, and I really thought that it would be. I felt that it would, in fact, be a really vital variable. I even ran a regression again using the original data, not the dummy variable, and I still had a p-value higher than 0.05. That tells me that changes in employment were not related to the median renter housing costs in this analysis. So if I could wave a magic wand and, well, actually, no, let's go back a little bit to public policy. I think that if we're talking about public policy and how we can make some changes based on this data, a real key is inclusive zoning. There are a lot of areas in which we have to provide, with inclusive zoning, you have to provide income and housing at various income level points. And I think that that's a great way to allow everyone an opportunity to be part of the metro life without undue cost burden. If we look at improving the data, I look for different independent variables to better explain the dependent. I used what I had, but I felt like the severely cost-burdened subset was quite specific, and I would have benefited by using broader independent variables, perhaps like access to public transportation, population statistics, or even the size of the household unit. I'd also like to have considered some converse variables like vacancy rates or eviction rates, and this might have provided a more well-rounded view of the topic. Thank you.